The Elize Matsunaga case. What led a woman to kill and dismember her husband? Chapter 1. The perfect life that wasn't. In the gleaming towers of Sao Paulo's financial district, where Brazil's wealthiest families conduct their business empires, the Matsunaga name commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Marcos Kitano Matsunaga was the heir to a food industry fortune, a man whose family's company, Yoki, had become synonymous with Brazilian cuisine and generated hundreds of millions in revenue annually. On the surface, Marcos appeared to have everything a man could desire. At 42, he was handsome, wealthy, and married to Elize Kitano Matsunaga, a stunning woman nearly 2 decades his junior, who had captured his heart with her beauty and ambition. Their penthouse apartment in the exclusive Higienopolis neighborhood was a testament to their success, filled with luxury furnishings and artwork that reflected their elevated social status. Elize, born Elize Araújo in the small city of Chopinzinho, Paraná, had travelled a remarkable journey from her humble origins to the pinnacle of Sao Paulo society. At 38, she was a nurse by training, who had transformed herself into the perfect trophy wife, attending charity galas, managing their household staff, and presenting the image of domestic bliss that wealthy Brazilian families expected from their matriarchs. Their daughter, Helena, was the apparent crown jewel of their union, a beautiful child who represented the continuation of the Matsunaga legacy and the promise of a future built on the foundation of their seemingly perfect marriage. To outside observers, the family embodied the Brazilian dream of success, prosperity, and happiness. But behind the marble facades and designer clothing, a different reality was unfolding. The marriage that looked so perfect from the outside was actually a battlefield where love had curdled into resentment, trust had been shattered by betrayal, and passion had transformed into something far more dangerous. The pressures of maintaining their public image while dealing with private demons were creating a toxic environment that would ultimately explode in violence. On May 19, 2012, this carefully constructed facade would come crashing down in the most shocking way possible. The man who seemed to have everything would be found dead, his body dismembered and scattered across the highways of Sao Paulo, in a crime so brutal and calculated that it would captivate Brazil and raise disturbing questions about the dark side of wealth, power, and marriage. The investigation that followed would reveal that the perfect life the Matsunagas had presented to the world was actually a carefully orchestrated lie, hiding secrets that would shock even the most cynical observers of Sao Paulo's elite society. The woman who had seemed like the ideal wife would be revealed as something far more complex and dangerous. Chapter 2. From humble origins to high society. Elize Araújo's transformation from a small-town girl to a member of Sao Paulo's elite was a journey that embodied both the possibilities and the perils of social mobility in modern Brazil. Born in 1974 in Chopinzinho, a modest city in Paraná state, known more for its agricultural production than its glamour, Elize grew up in circumstances far removed from the luxury she would later enjoy. Her childhood was marked by the typical struggles of middle-class families in Brazil's interior, where opportunities were limited and dreams of prosperity often seemed impossibly distant. Her parents worked hard to provide for their children, instilling in Elize the ambition and determination that would later drive her relentless pursuit of a better life in the big city. The decision to pursue nursing was both practical and aspirational for a young woman from her background. The profession offered stability, respect, and the possibility of social advancement that few other careers could provide for someone without family connections or inherited wealth. Elize threw herself into her studies with the intensity of someone who understood that education was her ticket to a different kind of life. Her move to Sao Paulo in the 1990s represented a leap of faith that millions of young Brazilians make every year, leaving the security of their hometowns to pursue opportunities in the country's economic capital. The city's overwhelming scale and competitive atmosphere could easily crush the dreams of newcomers. But Elize possessed the combination of beauty, intelligence, and ruthless ambition necessary to not just survive, but thrive. Working as a nurse in Sao Paulo's private healthcare system brought Elize into contact with the city's wealthy elite for the first time. She observed how they lived, how they spoke, and how they carried themselves, gradually absorbing the mannerisms and expectations of high society. Her natural intelligence and keen observational skills allowed her to reinvent herself, shedding her provincial origins like an old skin. The transformation was not just external, but psychological as well. Elize began to see herself not as a small-town girl who had gotten lucky, but as someone who deserved to be part of the elite world she was entering. This shift in self-perception would prove crucial to understanding her later actions and the sense of entitlement that would drive her to extreme measures. Her first marriage to Carlos Eduardo Araújo provided her with initial entry into Sao Paulo's middle class and gained her valuable experience in navigating the social expectations of urban Brazilian society. However, this relationship was ultimately a stepping stone rather than a destination, as Elize's ambitions extended far beyond middle-class respectability. The end of her first marriage coincided with her growing confidence in her ability to attract and manipulate wealthy men. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her intelligence and psychological sophistication that made her truly dangerous. She had learned to read people's desires and weaknesses, skills that would serve her well in her pursuit of the ultimate prize. When Elize met Marcos Matsunaga in 2004, she recognized immediately that he represented everything she had been working toward. He was not just wealthy, but heir to a business empire. Not just successful, but part of a family dynasty that commanded respect throughout Brazilian society. More importantly, he was vulnerable in ways that she could exploit. If you're following this complex story of ambition and deception, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The psychological depths we're about to explore will shock you. The courtship that followed was a masterclass in manipulation and seduction, as Elize deployed every skill she had learned during her years of social climbing to capture the heart and mind of one of Brazil's most eligible bachelors. Chapter 3. The Seduction of Power and Wealth. The relationship between Elize Araújo and Marcos Matsunaga began as a calculated campaign of seduction that would ultimately consume both of their lives. When they met in 2004, Marcos was a successful businessman in his mid-30s who had never married, despite his wealth and social position, making him one of Sao Paulo's most sought-after bachelors. Elize recognized in Marcos not just wealth and status, but also the psychological vulnerabilities that she could exploit to secure her position in his life. He was a man who had been raised with enormous privilege, but also enormous pressure, expected to maintain and expand the family business empire while living up to the expectations of previous generations of Matsunagas. The early stages of their relationship were characterized by intense passion and mutual fascination. Marcos was captivated by Elize's beauty and sophistication, while she was intoxicated by the access to power and luxury that he represented. Their courtship played out in the exclusive restaurants, private clubs, and luxury resorts that served as the playground for Sao Paulo's elite. Elize's approach to winning Marcos was sophisticated and multi-layered. She presented herself as the perfect combination of traditional femininity and modern ambition, someone who could serve as both a devoted wife and a capable partner in managing their social obligations. Her nursing background gave her an aura of caring and competence that appealed to Marcos's desire for a nurturing partner. The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. Elize made herself indispensable to Marcos by anticipating his needs, managing his social calendar, and providing the emotional support that his high-pressure lifestyle demanded. She became not just his girlfriend, but his confidant, advisor, and emotional anchor in a world where genuine relationships were rare. Their marriage in 2005 was a lavish affair that announced to Sao Paulo society that Elize had successfully completed her transformation from small-town nurse to member of the business elite. The wedding was covered extensively in the social pages, with photographs showing the beautiful couple surrounded by the cream of Brazilian society. The birth of their daughter Helena in 2006 seemed to cement Elize's position in the Matsunaga family and provide her with the ultimate insurance policy for her future security. As the mother of Marcos's only child and potential heir to the family fortune, she had achieved a level of status and protection that seemed unassailable. However, the reality of married life with Marcos proved to be far more complicated than Elize had anticipated. The wealth and status she had coveted came with expectations and restrictions that she found increasingly difficult to accept. The Matsunaga family's traditional values and conservative social circle often clashed with her more modern and independent sensibilities. Marcos himself proved to be a more complex and challenging partner than she had expected. While he was generous with money and genuinely seemed to love her, he was also controlling, demanding, and increasingly suspicious of her motives and activities. The pressure of running the family business made him moody and unpredictable, creating an atmosphere of tension in their household. The couple's different backgrounds and expectations began to create friction that would only intensify over time. Elize's ambition and desire for independence conflicted with Marcos's traditional expectations of a wife's role, while his growing paranoia about her loyalty created an atmosphere of mutual distrust and resentment. The lifestyle that had initially seemed like a dream began to feel more like a prison, as Elize realized that her wealth and status came with strings attached that limited her freedom and autonomy. The very success she had worked so hard to achieve was becoming a source of frustration and anger that would ultimately drive her to desperate measures. Chapter 4. The Marriage Behind Closed Doors. As the years passed, the fairy tale marriage between Elize and Marcos Matsunaga began to reveal its darker undercurrents, transforming from a love story into a psychological thriller played out behind the closed doors of their luxury penthouse. The pressures of maintaining their public image while dealing with private conflicts created a toxic environment that would ultimately prove explosive. Marcos's behavior became increasingly controlling and possessive, as his initial infatuation with Elize evolved into something more obsessive and paranoid. His wealth and social position had always allowed him to control his environment completely, and he expected the same level of control over his wife. He monitored her activities, questioned her friendships, and demanded detailed accounts of how she spent her time when they were apart. The psychological abuse was subtle but persistent, designed to undermine Elize's confidence and independence, while maintaining the appearance of a loving marriage to outside observers. Marcos would publicly praise and pamper his wife, while privately criticizing her background, her intelligence, and her worthiness to be part of the Matsunaga family legacy. Elize's response to this treatment was complex and contradictory. On one hand, she had achieved everything she had dreamed of and was reluctant to give up the lifestyle and status that marriage to Marcos provided. On the other hand, she was increasingly resentful of the restrictions and humiliations that came with her position as his wife. The couple's sexual relationship became another battlefield where power and control were contested. Marcos's demands became increasingly extreme and degrading, while Elize found herself submitting to behaviors that she found humiliating in order to maintain her position in the marriage. The intimacy that should have bonded them together instead became a source of mutual resentment and disgust. Financial control was another weapon in Marcos's arsenal of psychological manipulation. Despite the family's enormous wealth, Elize found herself having to justify every expenditure and ask permission for purchases that should have been routine for someone of her supposed status. This financial dependency was designed to remind her constantly of her subordinate position in the relationship. The birth of Helena had initially brought the couple together. But even their daughter became a source of conflict as Marcos used his paternal rights to further control Elize's behavior. He would threaten to limit her access to Helena or to use his wealth and connections to gain custody if she ever considered leaving the marriage. Elize's attempts to maintain friendships and outside interests were systematically undermined by Marcos, who viewed any relationship or activity that didn't revolve around him as a potential threat to his control. She found herself increasingly isolated from the support systems that might have helped her cope with the psychological abuse she was enduring. The couple's public appearances became elaborate performances, where both played their assigned roles while harboring growing resentment and hatred for each other. Elize became expert at presenting the image of the devoted wife, while privately planning her escape from what had become an increasingly unbearable situation. The psychological pressure of maintaining this facade while dealing with private abuse began to take its toll on Elize's mental health. She experienced periods of depression and anxiety that she was forced to hide from public view. While the anger and resentment she felt toward Marcos continued to build toward a dangerous crescendo. Share this story with others who need to understand how psychological abuse can escalate in relationships that appear perfect from the outside. Awareness can save lives. The breaking point was approaching as both Elize and Marcos became trapped in a marriage that had become a prison for both of them. Though neither was willing to be the first to admit defeat and face the public humiliation that divorce would bring to their carefully constructed image. Chapter 5. The Affair That Changed Everything. In 2011, Elize Matsunaga made a decision that would ultimately seal both her and her husband's fate. Feeling trapped in a marriage that had become a psychological prison and desperate for emotional connection and validation, she began an affair that would provide the catalyst for the violent explosion that was building within their relationship. The affair was not a casual fling, but an intense emotional and physical relationship that gave Elize the taste of the passion and respect that had been missing from her marriage to Marcos. Her lover was someone from outside the elite social circle that had become her world, providing her with a connection to a different kind of life and different possibilities for her future. For Elize, the affair represented more than just sexual satisfaction or emotional fulfillment. It was an act of rebellion against the control and manipulation that had defined her marriage, a way of reclaiming some measure of autonomy and self-respect that Marcos had systematically stripped away from her over the years. The psychological impact of the affair was profound, as it reminded Elize of who she had been before their marriage and who she might become if she could escape from Marcos's control. The contrast between how her lover treated her and how Marcos treated her became a constant source of anger and resentment that poisoned every interaction with her husband. However, conducting an affair while married to one of Sao Paulo's most prominent businessmen required careful planning and constant deception. Elize had to create elaborate cover stories for her absences, use burner phones to communicate with her lover, and maintain the facade of marital happiness, even as she was actively betraying her husband. The strain of living this double life began to take its toll on Elize's psychological state. The constant lying and deception, combined with the guilt and fear of discovery, created enormous stress that manifested in mood swings, anxiety, and increasingly erratic behavior that those close to her began to notice. Marcos, despite his controlling nature, initially failed to detect his wife's infidelity, perhaps because his own arrogance made it difficult for him to imagine that she would dare to betray him. However, Elize's behavior became more suspicious and her emotional distance from him became more apparent. He began to suspect that something was wrong. The investigation that Marcos launched into his wife's activities was thorough and ruthless, utilizing private investigators, surveillance technology, and his extensive network of contacts to uncover the truth about her affair. When the evidence of her betrayal was finally presented to him, his reaction was explosive and dangerous. The confrontation that followed was brutal and humiliating for Elize, as Marcos used his knowledge of her affair to justify even more extreme forms of psychological and emotional abuse. He threatened to expose her publicly, to take away their daughter, and to destroy her reputation and any possibility of a future outside their marriage. Rather than ending the affair, Marcos's threats only intensified Elize's resentment and desperation. She realized that her husband would never allow her to leave the marriage with her dignity or her daughter intact, and that her only options were to submit completely to his control, or to find a more permanent solution to their conflict. The affair had awakened something in Elize that could not be suppressed, a recognition of her own agency, and a refusal to accept the role of victim that Marcos had assigned to her. The woman who had once been willing to endure any humiliation to maintain her position was transforming into someone capable of taking extreme action to protect herself and secure her freedom. The psychological dynamics of their marriage had shifted irrevocably, with both Elize and Marcos now viewing their relationship as a war that only one of them could win. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end in violence and forever change both of their lives. Chapter 6: The Night That Changed Everything. May 19, 2012, began like any other evening in the Matsunaga household, with the couple maintaining their usual facade of domestic normalcy, while the tension between them simmered just beneath the surface. Their daughter, Helena, was staying with relatives, leaving Elize and Marcos alone in their penthouse apartment for what would prove to be their final confrontation. The events of that night would later be reconstructed through Elize's own testimony, physical evidence, and forensic analysis, revealing a sequence of events that transformed a marital dispute into one of Brazil's most shocking crimes. The luxury apartment that had been their sanctuary would become a crime scene that would horrify investigators and captivate the nation. According to Elize's account, the evening began with another argument about her affair and Marcos's continued threats to destroy her life if she attempted to leave the marriage. The psychological warfare that had characterized their relationship for months reached a new level of intensity as Marcos became increasingly aggressive and threatening in his language and behavior. The argument escalated when Marcos allegedly became physically violent, grabbing Elize and threatening her with bodily harm if she continued to defy his authority. For a woman who had endured years of psychological abuse, this physical assault represented a line that could not be crossed, triggering a response that surprised even her with its violence and finality. In a moment that would forever change her life, Elize retrieved a gun that Marcos kept in their apartment for security purposes. The weapon, a .380 caliber pistol, was something that Marcos had insisted on keeping, despite living in one of Sao Paulo's most secure buildings, perhaps reflecting his growing paranoia about threats to his safety and status. The shooting itself was over in seconds, but its aftermath would consume years of legal proceedings and public fascination. Elize fired a single shot that struck Marcos in the head, killing him instantly and ending their toxic marriage in the most permanent way possible. The man who had controlled every aspect of her life for 7 years was dead by her hand. The killing of Marcos was only the beginning of Elize's ordeal. Faced with the reality of what she had done and the certainty that her life as she knew it was over, she made a series of decisions that would transform her from a woman who had killed in what she claimed was self-defense into someone capable of unimaginable brutality. Rather than calling the police or attempting to claim self-defense, Elize chose to cover up the crime in a way that revealed a level of calculation and coldness that shocked even hardened investigators. She spent the next several hours dismembering her husband's body, using kitchen knives and other household tools to reduce the man she had once loved to manageable pieces. The dismemberment was not the work of someone in a panic or psychological breakdown, but rather a methodical process that required planning, determination, and a complete suppression of normal human emotions. Elize worked through the night, carefully separating Marcos's body into pieces that she could transport and dispose of without detection. The psychological state that allowed Elize to perform such a gruesome task remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Chapter 7. The Cover-Up and Discovery. The hours following Marcos Matsunaga's murder revealed a side of Elize that even she may not have known existed. A cold, calculating individual, capable of methodically destroying evidence and constructing elaborate deceptions to cover up her crime. The woman who had once been concerned with maintaining the perfect image of marital bliss now focused all her energy on avoiding detection for the ultimate act of marital betrayal. After dismembering her husband's body, Elize faced the challenge of disposing of the remains without arousing suspicion. She loaded the pieces into suitcases and bags, using her knowledge of Sao Paulo's geography and traffic patterns to plan a disposal route that would minimize the risk of discovery, while maximizing the likelihood that the remains would never be found. The disposal process took place over several days, with Elize making multiple trips to different locations around Sao Paulo to scatter Marcos's remains. She chose remote areas along highways and in rural locations outside the city, believing that the pieces would be consumed by animals or decompose beyond recognition before anyone discovered them. Her choice of disposal locations revealed a sophisticated understanding of forensic investigation and police procedures. Rather than simply dumping everything in one location, she spread the remains across multiple jurisdictions, making it more difficult for investigators to piece together what had happened and potentially causing confusion about where the crime had actually occurred. The psychological state required to carry out such a methodical disposal of her husband's body remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Elize later described feeling detached and mechanical during this process, as if she were watching someone else perform these actions rather than doing them herself. Meanwhile, she began constructing an elaborate story to explain Marcos's absence to family members, friends, and business associates. She told different people different versions of events, claiming that he had traveled for business, was dealing with personal issues, or was taking time away from the family to think about their relationship. The deception required constant vigilance and creativity, as Elize had to respond to increasingly concerned inquiries from Marcos's family and business partners. She used his phone to send text messages that made it appear he was alive and traveling, while deflecting requests for direct contact by claiming he was too busy or stressed to speak with people. The investigation began when Marcos failed to appear for important business meetings, and his family became concerned about his uncharacteristic silence. The Matsunaga family's prominence and wealth ensured that the police took their missing person report seriously and began an immediate and thorough investigation. Detective Paulo Henrique Santos, who led the investigation, quickly identified inconsistencies in Elize's story and began focusing on her as a potential suspect. Her behavior during questioning was suspicious, alternating between apparent grief and strange detachment that experienced investigators recognized as potential signs of deception. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Elize had purchased cleaning supplies and other materials that could be used to clean up a crime scene. Surveillance footage from stores and gas stations began to reveal her movements in the days following Marcos's disappearance, creating a timeline that contradicted her stated activities. The discovery of Marcos's remains began with a gruesome find by highway workers who discovered what appeared to be human body parts in a remote area outside Sao Paulo. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Marcos. And the investigation quickly intensified as police realized they were dealing with a homicide rather than a missing person case. Additional remains were discovered at other locations as police expanded their search based on analysis of Elize's cell phone records and surveillance footage. Each new discovery added to the evidence against her and revealed the full scope of her efforts to cover up the crime. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. DNA analysis confirmed the identity of the remains, while forensic examination of the Matsunaga apartment revealed traces of blood and other evidence that proved Marcos had been killed there despite Elize's extensive cleaning efforts. Chapter 8. The Arrest and Confession. On June 8, 2012, nearly 3 weeks after Marcos Matsunaga's murder, Sao Paulo police arrested Elize at her apartment in a dramatic operation that was broadcast live on television news. The arrest of the wealthy socialite for the brutal murder and dismemberment of her husband sent shockwaves through Brazilian society and marked the beginning of one of the country's most closely watched criminal cases. The evidence against Elize was overwhelming and irrefutable. Forensic analysis had confirmed that Marcos had been killed in their apartment. Surveillance footage had tracked her movements during the disposal of his remains, and physical evidence linked her directly to both the murder and the cover-up. Faced with this mountain of evidence, her initial denials quickly crumbled. The interrogation that followed was a psychological chess match between experienced detectives and a woman who had demonstrated remarkable cunning in covering up her crime. Detective Santos and his team used a combination of evidence presentation and psychological pressure to gradually break down Elize's defenses and force her to confront the reality of her situation. The confession, when it finally came, was both shocking and anticlimactic. Elize admitted to killing Marcos, but claimed that she had acted in self-defense during a violent argument about her affair. However, her explanation for the dismemberment and disposal of his body was less convincing, revealing the calculated nature of her actions after the initial shooting. According to her confession, the decision to dismember Marcos's body was made in a state of panic and desperation, driven by fear of the consequences she would face if the truth about their marriage and his death became public. She claimed that she had not planned the murder, but had made the decision to cover it up in order to protect herself and her daughter. The psychological evaluation that followed her arrest revealed a complex individual who combined elements of narcissistic personality disorder with the trauma responses typical of long-term abuse victims. Mental health experts struggled to categorize Elize's mental state and motivations, finding evidence of both calculated planning and genuine psychological distress. Her confession provided crucial details about the crime that helped investigators understand the sequence of events and the methods used to dispose of Marcos's body. However, it also raised new questions about her mental state and the extent to which her actions were premeditated versus reactive. The public reaction to Elize's arrest and confession was intense and divided. Some viewed her as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered her husband for financial gain, while others saw her as a victim of domestic abuse who had been driven to desperate measures by years of psychological torture. The media coverage was extensive and often sensationalized, with television programs and newspapers providing detailed coverage of every aspect of the case. The combination of wealth, beauty, violence, and sexual scandal made the story irresistible to Brazilian media outlets and their audiences. Elize's family and friends struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the person who had committed such a brutal crime. Many expressed shock and disbelief, while others revealed that they had suspected problems in her marriage, but had never imagined that the situation could escalate to violence. The legal team that Elize assembled was among the best that money could buy, including some of Brazil's most prominent criminal defense attorneys. Their strategy focused on portraying her as a victim of domestic abuse who had been driven to kill in self-defense, while minimizing the significance of the dismemberment and cover-up. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Fabio Munoz, faced the challenge of proving premeditation and demonstrating that Elize's actions went far beyond what could be justified as self-defense. The brutal nature of the dismemberment and the elaborate cover-up provided powerful evidence of her calculated mindset after the killing. Share this story to help others understand how domestic abuse can escalate to unthinkable violence. Awareness and intervention can prevent tragedies. Chapter 9. The Trial and its Revelations. The trial of Elize Matsunaga began on November 28, 2016, more than 4 years after her arrest. In a Sao Paulo courthouse that had been transformed into a media circus, the proceedings would captivate Brazil for weeks as the most intimate details of the Matsunaga marriage were exposed, and the question of whether Elize was a victim or a cold-blooded killer was debated before the nation. Judge Marixa Fabiane Rodriguez presided over the trial with the challenging task of separating fact from fiction, in a case where both the prosecution and defense presented compelling but contradictory narratives about the events leading up to Marcos's death. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of both families seeking justice for their loved ones. The prosecution's case, led by prosecutor Fabio Munoz, painted Elize as a calculating killer who had murdered her husband for financial gain and then attempted to cover up her crime through an elaborate deception. They argued that the dismemberment and disposal of Marcos's body demonstrated a level of premeditation and coldness that was incompatible with claims of self-defense. The evidence presented by the prosecution was methodical and devastating. Forensic experts testified about the crime scene, the dismemberment process, and the disposal of the remains, providing graphic details that shocked even experienced court observers. The timeline of events, reconstructed through surveillance footage and cell phone records, revealed the calculated nature of Elize's actions after the murder. Financial experts testified about the Matsunaga family's wealth and Elize's potential inheritance, suggesting that money had been a significant motive for the murder. The prosecution argued that Elize had killed Marcos to secure her financial future and avoid the consequences of a divorce that would have left her with limited resources. The defense team, led by attorney Fabio Aprobato Machado, presented a dramatically different narrative that portrayed Elize as a victim of years of psychological and physical abuse, who had killed her husband in a moment of desperation and self-defense. They argued that the dismemberment and cover-up were the actions of a traumatized woman in a state of panic, rather than evidence of premeditation. Expert witnesses for the defense testified about the psychological effects of domestic abuse and how victims often develop complex coping mechanisms that can include violence against their abusers. They argued that Elize's actions, while extreme, were a manifestation of her psychological trauma, were consistent with the behavior of someone who had been systematically abused and feared for her life. The testimony about the Matsunaga marriage was particularly revealing, exposing the toxic dynamics that had characterized their relationship behind closed doors. Witnesses described Marcos's controlling behavior, his threats against Elize, and the psychological warfare that had defined their interactions in the months leading up to his death. Elize's own testimony was the most dramatic moment of the trial, as she took the stand to describe her version of events and explain her actions on the night of the murder. Her account of years of abuse and the final confrontation that led to Marcos's death was emotional and detailed, providing insight into her mental state and motivations. However, her testimony also revealed inconsistencies and gaps that the prosecution exploited to challenge her credibility. Her explanation for the dismemberment and disposal of Marcos's body was particularly unconvincing, that she struggled to explain how someone in a state of panic could have carried out such a methodical and gruesome process. The psychological evaluation of Elize became a central focus of the trial, with competing experts offering different interpretations of her mental state and capacity for premeditation. The complexity of her psychological profile made it difficult for the jury to determine whether she was a victim who had been driven to desperate measures or a calculating killer who had planned her husband's murder. The testimony from the couple's daughter, Helena, was particularly heartbreaking, as the young girl described her memories of her parents' relationship and the impact that the crime had on her life. Her innocence and vulnerability served as a reminder of the human cost of the violence that had destroyed her family. Like and subscribe to follow more complex criminal cases that explore the thin line between victim and perpetrator. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for preventing future tragedies. Chapter 10: Justice, Consequences and Unanswered Questions. On December 5, 2016, after days of deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict in one of Brazil's most closely watched criminal trials. Elize Matsunaga was found guilty of murder with aggravating circumstances and sentenced to 19 years, 11 months, and 1 day in prison. The verdict represented a compromise between the prosecution's demand for maximum punishment and the defense's argument for self-defense, reflecting the jury's recognition of both the brutality of her crime and the complex circumstances that led to it. The sentence was met with mixed reactions from the public and legal experts. Some felt that justice had been served and that Elize's punishment was appropriate for the severity of her crime, while others argued that the sentence was either too harsh or too lenient given the circumstances of the case. The complexity of the domestic abuse dynamics made it difficult for many to categorize Elize simply as either victim or perpetrator. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom, sparking national conversations about domestic violence, women's rights, and the justice system's ability to handle complex cases involving intimate partner violence. The trial had exposed the dark reality of abuse within wealthy families and challenged stereotypes about who could be victims or perpetrators of domestic violence. Elize's imprisonment marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, as she was forced to adapt to the harsh realities of Brazil's prison system after years of luxury and privilege. Her status as a high-profile inmate made her both a target and a curiosity within the prison population, requiring special security measures to ensure her safety. The psychological impact of her actions and imprisonment continued to affect Elize's mental health as she struggled to come to terms with the destruction of her family and the consequences of her choices. Prison psychologists worked with her to address the trauma and psychological issues that had contributed to her crime, while she also faced the challenge of maintaining a relationship with her daughter from behind bars. Helena Matsunaga, now an orphan due to her mother's actions, became the center of a custody battle between the Matsunaga and Araújo families. The court ultimately awarded custody to Marcus's family, ensuring that she would be raised with the financial resources and social connections that her father's wealth provided, but also separating her from her mother during crucial developmental years. The financial consequences of the case were significant for all involved. The Matsunaga family's business empire survived the scandal, but the negative publicity and legal costs took their toll on the company's reputation and operations. Elize lost access to the wealth that had motivated her social climbing and was left dependent on court-appointed attorneys and family support for her legal defense. The case also prompted changes in how Brazilian law enforcement and the justice system handle cases involving domestic violence and intimate partner homicide. Training programs were developed to help investigators and prosecutors better understand the complex dynamics of abusive relationships and the factors that can drive victims to violence. Media coverage of the case continued long after the trial ended, with documentaries, books, and television programs exploring different aspects of the story. The case became a cultural phenomenon that reflected broader anxieties about gender roles, social mobility, and violence in Brazilian society. The question of whether Elize was primarily a victim or a perpetrator remained unresolved for many observers, highlighting the complexity of cases where domestic abuse intersects with extreme violence. Her story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of toxic relationships and the potential for violence when psychological abuse escalates unchecked. The Matsunaga case also exposed the limitations of wealth and social status in protecting families from the destructive forces of domestic violence. Despite their privilege and resources, the family was unable to prevent the tragedy that destroyed their lives and left a young girl without parents. As Elize serves her sentence, the case continues to raise important questions about justice, redemption, and the possibility of rehabilitation for those who commit extreme acts of violence. Her story remains a complex and troubling example of how love can transform into hatred, and how the pursuit of wealth and status can lead to the ultimate destruction of everything one claims to value. The legacy of the Matsunaga case serves as a reminder that domestic violence affects families at all levels of society, and that the warning signs of escalating abuse must be recognized and addressed before they lead to tragedy. The price of ignoring these signs was measured in the destruction of a family and the loss of lives that could have been saved through intervention and support. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.